Hello everybody, and thanks again for tuning into my YouTube channel. And today I'm very quickly going to go through this idea of focus stacking that is new in the Fujifilm X-T2 firmware 4. So the very first thing you'll have to do is make sure that your camera, your X-T2, is updated to the firmware 4, which was released on the 8th of May 2018. It's a very simple process. Just go to the Fujifilm website, search for the X-T2 firmware, make sure it's version 4, download it to an empty memory card onto your computer. Pop it into the camera, make sure you have a charged battery, that's very important, fully charged battery I should say. Switch the camera on holding down the disp back button, and then you will be proceeding with the upgrade. It will give you the instructions on the back of the camera. I think focus stacking is going to be really good for landscape photographers and technical macro type photographers. For me personally, as a reportage photographer, I'm probably not going to use it that often, but it's something that came up in the comments quite often when I did the firmware update video on Tuesday. People were like, "Oh great, this is brilliant, you know, how do we do it, what's it for?" So I thought maybe I'll just run through this today for you. A couple of things to bear in mind before you start. You will absolutely 100% need a very, very stable tripod. This is not something that you can do. Even if you're doing macro photography in the studio, you're still going to need a very stable tripod for this. So get yourself a good set of legs. If you're shooting outdoors or you're shooting landscapes or anything like that, there's always going to be some kind of light change. There might be some foliage movement, or the clouds are going to move, etc. So the process we're going to use today is actually going to use Photoshop, which is a very manual, and it's actually quite a slow process using Photoshop to do it this way. There are plugins, but this is the way that most of you who haven't got plugins or don't want to buy plugins and have Photoshop, and this will be true for any version of Photoshop, it doesn't have to be Photoshop CC, will be able to do your focus stacking. The fact is that you will use the camera to take the frames, but you will still manually need to blend them afterwards. The camera does not do that element for you. So in this case, just to keep things very simple, I've taken a picture of my watch. It's not very interesting, I'm afraid, but hey, you know, it's going to do the job, I think. And I've got 62 frames here, as you can see in the library view. And the most important thing right at the very beginning is to ensure that they are all have the same exposure that you want, or the same settings that you want. If you look across these frames here, you'll see the first one, well, it's actually 3-2, but it's the first frame in the series, is focused here at the bottom. I've set this to use the 60mm macro lens, the XF 60mm f2.4 macro lens, which is one of the original Holy Trinity lenses, if you like, that came along with the X Pro 1 back in 2012, whenever it was. You need to shoot manually, totally manually. If you want to use one of the auto modes, aperture priority or time priority, to give you a meter reading, to give you an exposure, then absolutely fine. But then make sure that the camera is set to manual, because you want those exposures to be locked in as best as possible. But there will be changes. There will be changes in the just very subtle movement. If somebody walks by or a lorry goes by or something like that, which is what happened in this instance, then there's going to be vibrations and that gets picked up. So here's the first image, and if we whip all the way through to the last image, you'll see the depth of field is right at the top of the watch. So the idea is to take all of the steps in between and merge them together and make a one large, very sharp, very tack sharp, detailed image. So the very first thing you need to do in the camera is set up the frames, the steps, and the intervals. So the frames are the amount of pictures the camera is going to take. The step is the distance, if you like, between each step. So the lower that number, the closer the focus change will be, or the less the focus distance change will be, I should say. And the interval is the amount of seconds it's going to take between each one. I would actually suggest setting it to maybe 2 or 3 seconds, perhaps, just to give your camera time to stabilize if there is any movement caused by the shutter itself. And on that point, I'm shooting this using the electronic shutter in the Fuji X-T2. The electronic shutter is going to give you even less movement. The mechanical shutter will give some movement, although, like I said, if you're on a very, very good tripod, that should be very minimal. But the electronic shutter will give you a little bit more of a bite of the cherry in terms of keeping the camera as still as possible throughout the procedure. So we're going to go right the way back to the first image. Whoops. And I'm just going to bring it up, and you can already see there's kind of shifts in the movement. You can see shifts in the exposure, and if you're in a very good studio lighting environment where you can control it completely, then that's going to be even better for you. So I'm just going to make sure that everything is okay here. If I make any adjustments or any changes to the first image, I just want to copy it right across. So I'll highlight all of them. I'll do edit, I'll do develop settings, I'll do sync. and I will synchronize across any changes that I make. The only thing I did change was the white balance, and so I'll just do synchronize, and that will go right the way across all of those images in that selection. Now that's it in terms of Lightroom. That's all we need to do really. We now need to go back to the view of all the images, make sure they're all highlighted. So I'm just going to do Control A or Command A to ensure they're all highlighted. I'm then going to do right click, and I'm going to do Edit in, Open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, this is important. So open as layers in Photoshop. So this will just start the process to opening up in Photoshop. So you'll see once Photoshop is opened, it will start opening, it will start adding each of those images as a layer in the bottom right hand side. Here they come. Layer 0, background, layer, next 64, it starts at the top and works its way down, so 64, 63, etc. And that will just go, that will bring them all into the image, into the Photoshop application. Now another thing to note while it's doing this process is that I've shot these images as JPEGs. You know, RAW is going to give you much more latitude, but it's also going to take a lot longer for Photoshop to do its blending. So for the purpose of this test, I've just shot JPEG. So JPEG is going to be quicker, but it's going to give you less latitude in the editing. So if this is a commercial shot or it's a highly important image, then obviously RAW is probably the way you're going to go. Another quick tip, if you are testing this yourself on your watch, make sure that the second hand is still, don't move it. I've had to pull the little plug out on the side of my watch there to ensure that the second hand isn't going. That's one thing I forgot the first time I did this, and of course that's going to introduce a lot of motion into the images. Okay, so when all of the images are in, all of the layers are created, you can see them all here in the bottom right hand side. The important thing is to make sure now that all of those layers are selected. So I'm going to click on the top one, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to press the Shift key on my keyboard, highlight the bottom one, that's going to select all of those layers. Then I need to go up to the Edit menu and I need to choose Auto Align Layers. Now I'm just going to select the defaults here, you just need to leave it on Auto, and I'm going to click OK. Now what's going to happen here, it's going to take a little bit of time, but Photoshop is going to go through each of these layers and it's going to look for any subtle changes, any movement, any kind of light changes, anything that's very subtle. It's going to try and deal with that behind the scenes, and it's going to process that as it goes. It takes a little bit of time depending on how many images you have, the size of those images, etc. And it can be quite a slow process. So at this point I will either go and answer some emails. I've got it's a good opportunity for me to tell you about my next wedding PJ workshop, which is in Amersham at the end of July. Details below and also on the screen now. If you want to come along to that, that'll be great. It's always a good day. But I think while this is doing this, I'll probably head off, pick up my phone and play a little bit of social chess. So hey guys, if you play chess, I'm not very good at it by the way, but one of the things that I do to try and get my head out of the social media world and everything else that goes on is I play social chess a lot on my phone. It's a great app, social chess. I'm not affiliated with it in any way, shape or form. I pay for it. And yeah, my details for that are on the screen. Also, if you fancy connecting and playing a game of chess at some point. Okay, and once that's done, we go to make sure that you can see some kind of subtle changes on the edges there. Let's try to frame it a little bit. And I'm going to leave that for the time being, but I'm going to make sure that everything is selected again. It's still really important to make sure all of those layers are selected, and go right back up to the Edit menu again. And this time I'm going to choose Auto Blend Layers. Okay, so Auto Blend, just going to leave it defaults again, stack images, seamless tones, content aware fill, transparent areas, etc. Just hit OK. And again, this procedure might take a little bit more time, so it's time for another game of chess. At the minute, it's creating the layer masks, and I'll show you what they mean in a moment when it's done. It's now going through the seamless composition, whatever that means. Now it's going to go through the trimming process. Okay, so we're nearly done now. You can see that there on the bottom right hand side you have the final merged layer. It says merged in brackets, and underneath that you have all of the other layers with their layer masks attached. And if you went through those, I'm not going to do it obviously, it's going to take way too much time, but you can just about see that in each of those layer masks it's going to show you where the focus area was in each individual frame. So you can see now that the image is pretty much finished. Obviously this is just a very rough test image. All of the problems on the screen in terms, or the watch screen I should say, in terms of the dirt here, there's a little bit of dust, there's stuff going on here and crumbs and all that kind of stuff that now need to be adjusted and touched up if you like. You can do that in Photoshop or you can do it in Lightroom later. So I'm happy with the sharpness. Look at the detail there. All of those individual steps have made that image that sharp all the way through. Now, like I say, you will have to find the amount of steps and the frames and the actual interval that works for you. By and large, you're going to have to do a little bit of trial and error, I think, to get the ones that work correctly for you. Now, the final step, I think, for this basically is to just blend all of the layers together or merge them all together. So I'm going to highlight them all. I'm going to right click. And I'm just going to choose merge layers, or actually I'm going to do a flatten image to flatten it down completely. So that will take a couple of seconds also. It's just going to, once you do this step, by the way, there's no going back. I mean, you've got the history panel, but once this is done and Photoshop is closed down, then you're with this final image. So now we have this one final layer that I would need to do any kind of retouching and cropping, etc. So once it's done and you've either done your adjustments in Photoshop, you're done, you're finished. You can take it back into Lightroom if you wish. I'm just going to close it down and say yes to that. Okay, and there it is. So that's the final kind of image that's come straight through. It's a TIFF file, so it will be quite large. And this is what I'm going to go into the default. Into the develop mode. I'm just going to apply my color warm filter to it. Do any kind of final retouching that I might need to do. So I'm just going to remove that spot, and then I'm going to do the same with this one. And if you want to retouch all of this stuff up, these scratches, etc., obviously you'll want to have cleaned those first in the first place. But the things like the fine hair, etc., you're probably better off doing that in Photoshop. But there you go. So if we zoom in, you can see the sharpness. It's a pretty detailed. Look at the the thumbnail there, the thumbprint. That's where I pulled the plug out. Look, to try and stop the watch, to stop the time, the second hand moving around. You can see a lot of detail there in the second hand itself. So there you go. That's how you do focus stacking in the X-T2. It's a pretty brutal affair using Photoshop. It can take a little bit of time, but you get there in the end. And it's trial and error, but hopefully that will give you at least the procedure to use when you're using the X-T2. Remember, you do need firmware number 4 on the X-T2 to be able to do this, but the process is the same for whichever version of Photoshop you have. Okay, thanks very much for tuning in once again. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do like it, please do subscribe it, and I shall see you next time.